Good morning, world. It is February 21st, 2022 at 10:42 a.m. in my neck of the woods. And God, there's so much coming at me. It's like I just really didn't hesitate, didn't think about what it was I was going to say this morning, and I'm just coming after it or getting after it like Navy SEAL Team 6, truth bomb in the con. So it's President's Day, right? And so on this day, we're supposed to kind of remember and consider some of the sacrifices of some of our great leaders throughout history. You know, when you think of great presidents, I certainly don't think of the last several, but going back to the beginning, President Washington and, of course, President Lincoln are two of the guys that we always see come up on, I don't know, thumbnails or any sort of reference to this day. And when you think about both of them, the two things that really kind of drew them together was this notion of honesty, right? Honest Abe, and then, of course, George Washington, the story of the cherry tree, and they could not tell a lie. Obviously, we know about George Washington being probably the richest man as a president in the history of the United States, given all of his wealth and being a slave owner and that sort of thing, which is obviously slightly contradictory to the image that we have. And, you know, Abraham Lincoln was, I really don't see a lot of flaws in Abraham Lincoln, other than it probably was a lot later getting to abolitionism and or the abolitionist movement and the Civil War and everything else that you know, Abraham Lincoln was trying to maintain the Union. And obviously, when the Confederates went south, literally, you know, it was the job of the industrial Northeast to keep them in check. But it did become about slavery, and I think that's where I want to start today's discussion because, you know, we've reached literally, I think, 120,000 views in less than 2 weeks. And it's just extraordinary how much energy that we're generating. And I do know that there's a lot of African Americans that have started tuning in. And I think I really need to address you folks first. So we're all aware of just the grotesque history, or I should say those of us who actually are on the right side of history, but you know, of what took place to shape the history of the African American evolution in the United States after slavery, several hundred years of slavery, 400 years of slavery, everything that was revealed later to be financial innovation based on human capital, and everything that construct derides in context this hierarchical Confederate sort of paradigm, right? Where after the Civil War, it leads into Jim Crow, and then ultimately that creates this great migration that starts with our story. So what I need you people to understand is, and it's something that you actually are very intuitively aware of, but the details matter. You were targeted in the run-up to the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. So I'm sure many people remember terminology based on what we called the Community Reinvestment Act. And that came out of the era of redlining. And so redlining was when banks literally circled neighborhoods around the United States, particularly in the inner cities, primarily constituted of African Americans, where they wouldn't lend. And so the African American community really didn't have an opportunity to get into home ownership and other things that could actually create upward mobility and you know, provide their you know, the slice of the American pie to the African Americans who really had given so much sweat, toil, blood, soul, everything to the evolution in the United States experience. Not to mention, of course, the artistic achievements of the greats from, you know, I'm struck by the poets and the artists and the jazz musicians of Harlem and everything that constitutes. And, you know, the African American community in their history was always a huge influence on me. I mean, some of my greatest heroes range from, you know, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali and Jimi Hendrix and so many other fantastic musicians and Prince. And, you know, I could go on, especially athletes. And one of which I should actually mention his name right now because I think he's relevant, quite frankly, to the story that I'm trying to tell you, which is LeBron James grew up 400 feet from the Antioch Baptist Church in Akron, Ohio, where Miss Addie Polk was a member for over 4 decades, and she just lived right down the street. And she is the very beginning of what we reveal in our incredible work, The Con, which is the story everybody is looking for, everybody senses, because they figure that the system is rigged, it's corrupt, and all of these things, but nobody knows the details. And it literally starts with the African American community that we portray with Addie Polk, because Addie Polk in October of 2008 was being evicted from her home. It was a home that she owned. She was confused. She didn't understand why the authorities were there. She had actually received eviction notices, and she had gone to both the sheriff's office and other areas within Akron, Ohio, to try to find somebody to help her because she knew she owned her home. But you can imagine at this time, being elderly, not having a lot of resources to be able to find the right people, probably your pleas fell on deaf ears. And so when they came to evict her, and being forced with homelessness, and all the gravity that must have been going through her mind at that time, she chose to turn her husband's gun, his Colt 45, on herself, and she shot herself, and she wound up dying about 4 months later. But what we learned from that story, and I had heard this over and over and over, because my story starts in 2008, because I had been an upwardly mobile professional. I've been a producer for a long time. I was actually giving away houses on to people on a television show around the country. And then suddenly in 2007, the executive producer of our show, who was flying around on G5s one day, literally was going bankrupt the next. And my executive producer was going nuts. They literally almost came to blows on the set. And from that day forward, the whole world melted down, and ultimately led to me going through a foreclosure disaster that turned my life upside down and almost led me to the same fate that Addie Polk did. But instead, I literally sat up on top of a cliff in Little Cottonwood Canyon, overlooking about a 500-foot drop, and I thought about ending it using the lexicon or the verbiage that we say in my neck of the woods. I was thinking about sending it. But I said to myself and God, I said, look, man, I'm going to get to the bottom of what the hell this is. And I did. And what it led to was this incredible convergence between African Americans and, quite frankly, the white working class. So what we show in The Con is that there was a systemology through lending known as predation. And I remember hearing this all the time back in, let's call it the early 2000s, or I should say like 2008, 9, 10 period, particularly from Elizabeth Warren. And I personally never understood the notion of predatory loans. I always kind of figured, for my situation, buyer beware. You take a loan based on what you can afford to pay back, and that's your risk, and that's the bank's risk. And if you're worthy of the credit, then you receive a loan, and then you can put it into purchases like home ownership or a car, or a child's education and that sort of thing. And hopefully you continue to maintain the income to be able to maintain that debt service. And then ultimately, like Americans did throughout the ages, they used to have these what they call mortgage burning parties when they would celebrate the final payment on a 30-year mortgage, right? 30-year fix. So therein lies this incredible diabolical scheme that got perverted and inverted and turned upside down and inside out to create this financial, diabolical, satanic frickin' monster behind the scenes. And what that machine does is it creates a ton of capital to create loans that create packaging of loans to be able to move through the system, of which everybody gets a fee, and then ultimately it moves up the pipeline, and all of those securities get sold to pensions. That's where the white working class comes in. So the white working class, they work their whole lives, and of course many of us who've been around for a few decades know that we were once a great manufacturing empire. But that changed pretty much from the 70s onward, where we basically killed the golden goose, is the way I like to refer to it. But we still had a manufacturing base, and we still do to this day, but not nearly as involved as it was then, particularly after World War II and everything that created to help rebuild the world after World War II. And in this process, the middlemen determined that, okay, there's this game that you can leverage, and you can create equity based on payment schedules and all sorts of investments where you can hide who's on the hook and all of these different things if you don't understand the mosaic and this black box casino that the financiers actually develop. And what the whole process is ultimately is that they can make short-term profits in huge numbers, setting everybody else up to fail. And most of the time they do it with other people's money. That's the hat trick. Right? Speaking of which, it was funny. I was just thinking to myself a few minutes ago. I mean, I've gotten a lot of comments, and people are like, hey, this guy reminds me of this and that. And, I used to be, a long time ago when I had long hair in college, and I actually wore glasses for a spit. People used to mix me up for the Hanson brothers from that movie Slapshot. And so here I am basically pulling a Hanson brothers SEAL Team 6 on this diabolical financialization that took out the African Americans and ultimately the white working class, because that's how the scheme works with the manipulators of media, is they got to keep everybody at each other's throats so they can get paid by this frickin' betrayal of our system, of which when you build it up through the pipeline, you learn that the guys who set up the elderly black women who were widows who had equity in their houses, think about that, the most vulnerable amongst us, like Addie Polk, they literally had a criteria. They had a game plan. They had a formula where they went to City Hall, they went to the Registry of Deeds, they studied which of these women actually had equity in their houses, and if they owned their homes, and they knew that they were on a fixed income, and they also knew that the cities, who actually at about this time, and I'm talking about late 1990s, early 2000s, would basically put notices on their doors saying, if you don't get your sidewalk fixed or your driveway or your roof, then we're going to fine you. And so a lot of these women who didn't have, who lost their husbands, like in the case of Addie Polk, and they lived on a fixed income, they didn't have extra money to be able to, suddenly go spend $5,000, $10,000 to get their roof fixed and their sidewalks fixed and so forth. And lo and behold, here comes this broker, somebody who actually looked like them from their community, somebody who was probably in their church and actually got that information, to be honest with you, inside the church. And we've got some evidence of that, where they would target these people, and they would take out loans, because the brokers would say, your house is now worth exponentially more than you think it's worth. And it's based on this calculus and everything else, which means that I could give you a loan for that. You could refinance your house. You could take out that extra cash to pay for the medications, clothes, whatever you needed at that time, because you didn't have extra capital. And it was literally like they described manna from heaven. Now, it wasn't just the elderly widow African-American women that got targeted. Eventually, all African Americans got targeted. I've got evidence of Wells Fargo and a formula within the system that targeted professional African Americans, that basically put them in a specific criteria where they would charge more interest on these loans, which they called high yield spread premium, so that even if these people had equity and they had income, they would still get the wrong end of the deal because of their skin color. It's insanity that this was going on to the level it was, and it was all baked in to this mythological, great economic expansion that followed really 9/11. Because in general, the American economy had stagnated. I think we were in a recession. I think that we had stagflation to some degree, and ultimately, we decided to pump out free money into speculators that landed in real estate, that went through this process where brokers and lenders and appraisers and everybody that's involved with the situation would appraise these homes and increase the appraisals, because then people could borrow against that, against their equity, especially if they came from a previous generation where they saved and they, purchased those homes and they increased the value, that they could then use that to refinance. And that's what, the likes of Rick Santelli, who I think is basically a paid frickin' propaganda hitman for the right-wing machine, that came out, roughly, I think, 2009, and started blaming President Obama, to create like these emergency stimulus programs to be able to help people refinance what they called the Loan Affordable Modification Program, or HAMP, I should say, Home Affordable Modification Program. And, that never happened because of this craziness of what Obama was doing at the time. But I really need to, I hope if I've kept your attention, those who are African American who may have had their parents who lost their homes, and you're like, how did that happen? Because my dad's a doctor? Well, it was because of this. Or if you knew somebody who lost their grandmother, like Addie Polk and that sort of thing, it's because of this. And ultimately, the numbers were insanity. I think by as late as 2014, we saw that 60% of all African American household wealth that, of course, been generated after the redlining, after slavery, after Jim Crow, all of those just horrible, terrorist, that's terrorism towards the African American community. They finally got a toehold in the American dream. They started building it only to be set up in this situation. And that's exactly what it was. Why was it a setup? And this is the ultimate bridge that I need everybody to understand, especially those who think I'm full of shit. If you think I'm full of shit, go to www.thecon.tv and study it, and then say I'm full of shit. I welcome all people that want to, debate, and they want to try to, bring different dimensions of the conversation. But what we got were the rudimentary facts of what it is that I'm expressing to you. So institutions that have been around for over 100 years, and some of the most successful financial institutions in the United States, particularly investment banks like Goldman Sachs, had verticals where they literally had warehouse lines that they pumped to second-party operators known as originators. And these guys were brokers all over the country, many of whom out of New York may have been Greenpoint on the West Coast. It could have been Countrywide, could have been NationStar, a whole slew of them. Actually, Goldman bought Greenpoint at one point, but as did Bank of America, Countrywide, and several others. But this will come full circle for you. So they provide these loans, these warehouse lines that are coming because there's an appetite of $70 trillion because, we got rid of the golden goose in the United States. We got rid of the working class. We shopped it out to, Asia, of course. We get most of our, energy from the Middle East at this time period. Obviously, a lot of fracking had taken place since then. But ultimately, in this scenario, Goldman has these pipelines, right? So back in the 70s, casinos came out of Vegas, and they started paying pensioners like the Teamsters, investments on their casinos. And the government came in, for example, and said, no, Vegas, you're corrupt to the gills. You've got the mafia involved. You can't manage these people's money, their retirement, and everything else. And so they created these laws that handed over all of these pension funds, particularly in these industries like trucking or steel industry and several other things, particularly out of the industrialized Midwest. And they said the likes of Goldman Sachs are going to manage this. So this is what it ultimately leads to. Goldman Sachs and their prestige, they have pensions all over the world, but particularly the United States. Let's keep it there. These pensions, which are people's retirements of the white working class. Obviously, there's African Americans and different colored folks from all sides of the equation that are involved with that as well. But primarily the white working class, and they got set up. They got set up because the guys that were selling these loans knew that they had gotten to the point where there was no more people that actually had income, that could sustain the payments, that were AAA, that were good risks. So the industry itself got rid of underwriting. That's what led to what most people think of subprime. It's not subprime. It's liar's loans. And they use these things called ninja loans, which means no income, no asset. And so, for example, it just undercuts every known law of lending that we've known for literally thousands of years. It just dissipated. So people who didn't have income, people who didn't have assets, right? They got loans for giant houses. A lot of the times, I literally came across scenarios where people who were, tomato pickers were living in houses in California that were, I think, $700,000 palaces. I'm not kidding, and that's not to blame the tomato picker that actually got into that. He was just doing what the brokers told him he could do. And why wouldn't you under those circumstances, right? You've got a job, you're working your ass off, you can make the payment that they say you're going to be making, but they don't know what's going on in terms of the, what's going to go on within the loan, because these loans were super opaque. They were like 40, 50, 60 pages long. They contradicted each other, and most of them were made up of documentation fabrication because a lot of these brokers wanted to get these people approved so they could get their fee. And so they would lie and they would create, fake W-2s, fake incomes, fake everything. And then that was what became what we called AAA. And AAA, I need to remind everybody that one of the big ones, which is Moody's, is owned by one of the largest investors in the United States to this day, by the name of Warren Buffett. Everybody thinks that Warren Buffett is a good guy, but Warren Buffett certainly has never had his feet held to the fire for his credit rating agencies taking unbelievable amounts of fees to be able to create this situation to where they put thousands upon thousands and 10,000s of these loans that were destined to fail into these verticals that they then packaged and sold around the world, of which then, of course, they sold to these pensions, right? So then I, on this great, journey, wind up meeting the likes of Addie Polk's ghost, who opens this golden door that leads us on his journey where I'm in the Midwest, particularly in Ohio, and I meet these former steel workers and these iron workers and these incredibly salt of the earth, They look like Popeye, but they've got, incredible swelling because of arthritis, because of 4 decades, on the job. And these guys worked, their tail to the bone to be able to save and live their part of the American dream, only to be set up, not by the mob, but by Goldman Sachs. You can make your own inference there, right? But it was known at every step of the way what was going to happen. And so after the collapse, and I don't think anybody, particularly of my age group that came out of the Bush administration, would be surprised to learn that George Bush, right? Well, you might be surprised to learn this, but this was a heavy duty, like, holy cow, when I figured this one out. Because when George Bush got, when he ran for president, it just seemed like there was this coordinated, spectacular sort of amalgamation of all the richest entities in the country that were supporting his candidacy. And I remember thinking at the time, well, my God, you've got the military-industrial complex behind him. You've got the fossil fuel complex behind him. You've got huge agriculture and all of these different parts of, our society that were getting behind George Bush. And, when you look at that matrix, especially for somebody like me, who's originally from Texas and I know a lot about the oil industry, you would think that somebody like Exxon was George Bush's largest contributor. Well, as it turns out, it was a guy by the name of Roland Arnall. Roland Arnall was the CEO of a company called AmeriQuest. And AmeriQuest specialized in predatory loans. They specialized in targeting people like Addie Polk and then basically through the pipeline selling all their product to Goldman Sachs, who were then shorting the market. So for example, if you've seen The Big Short, it's a great movie. I love Adam McKay. I love everything that Adam McKay does. But the movie is a thumbnail of what actually happened, and it gets a lot of it wrong. Particularly in the movie, the inference is that strip dancers who owned too many houses, who fancied themselves, professional businesswomen who had, this investment portfolio, as the ones who blew up the world. Even Adam McKay and his incredible research after the Michael Lewis book, which is, it's great work, but at the same time, it's suspect that they didn't bring this stuff to light. And what I'm telling you is that they knew, and they had ultimately, meaning the brokers, they knew that they were selling these products that were going to blow up. And then that Goldman, because they had this vertical, knew when it was going to blow up. And then they blew it up on their terms. And that's what created the Big Short. So, for example, what was depicted in the movie was Christian Bale played. God, this guy's name is always like at the top of mind for me, and I can't for the life of me think about it right now because I'm thinking about so many things. But anyway, Michael Burry. That was it, Michael Burry. So Christian Bale plays his character, as you may recall, and he's playing at the drums because he knows that they do their research and they're figuring out that, oh my God, this is going to bail. So, they're all cynical and they decide to short the market, and they ultimately make, I think, Burry, the real character, made $498 million, something like that. It was a big take. It was nothing compared to what Goldman was involved with a guy by the name of John Paulson. Not to be confused with Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson was former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who ended up becoming Treasury Secretary under George Bush, which followed a tradition of what happened, particularly after Reagan all the way through, where big Wall Street heads were, the Treasury Secretaries and head of Fed policy and that sort of thing. But ultimately, when we got to the Clinton administration, we had a guy by the name of Robert Rubin, who also came out of Goldman Sachs, and then worked as Treasury for Clinton, and then he was like a Mr. Fix-It guy for Citigroup, and that's a whole other huge part of the story. Actually, I will mention it here because it's still in the news and relevant, but the nature of Goldman Sachs, they created these shorts, which was intentional, okay? And so for the African-American community out there, a lot of us want to trust, a lot of you want to trust Barack Obama. I wanted to trust Barack Obama. I believed in the hope and change president that we can believe in, who rode this, incredible populist wave into the White House. And I expected all sorts of important things to happen, but they didn't. And they didn't because Obama played coverman for Wall Street. He did. Don't believe me? Watch The Con, www.thecon.tv. In fact, I think, I'm not an attorney, but I still to this day don't understand how he couldn't be on the hook, particularly if it could be proved, because he went on 60 Minutes with Scott Pelley, and he's a constitutional law expert, and he said, look, what Wall Street did may have been unethical and horrendous and all of these other things, but it wasn't illegal. Bullshit. It was illegal every step of the way. So when you go to somebody's house as a broker, like Addie Polk, and then you create a situation where you say, look, your house is worth this much when it's not. That's an actual felony. And you can say that you can, create all of these scenarios which we can justify giving you this money under these specific terms, and then they hide a whole bunch of terms, and then they do document fabrication within the loan. I should say the loan documents, and then ultimately that comes through the pipeline. That infinitum plus the appraisals plus what was happening in the credit rating agencies when they all knew that all of this stuff was going to blow up and the underwriting had been thrown out the window. All of that is illegal under civil rights statutes, but most importantly under this, and you have to understand this, we had protections for homeowners and people, as you would imagine, all sorts of consumer protections for people. And this one was called HOEPA, the Homeowner Equity Protection Act. And lo and behold, as it turns out, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve throughout this whole time, and for all you young people, I encourage you to go online and look at videos of Alan Greenspan, back in his heyday, giving speeches, because he kind of, gave these like obscure, strange references, and everybody filled in the blanks that this guy was some sort of wizard and he understood what was going on. He was just basically hiding this insane, diabolical, fraudulent enterprise that was taking place under his nose that he, as it turns out, through HOEPA with statutes, was mandated by Congress to basically regulate. And if he got information, from, let's call it the Federal Open Market Committee or people within the Federal Reserve and that sort of thing that let him know about everything that I'm telling you is exactly what was going on, it was incumbent upon him to cease it. But did he do that? No. We've got evidence that a guy by the name of Ned Gramlich, who came out of the Philadelphia Fed, who got information from all of our friends who are now part of the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that knew this stuff back in as early as 1999. They were telling him desperately, and these are professionals. They're not somebody who just like knee-jerks and say, hey, I think something's going on here. They did research for years and years and years. They got the evidence. They took it to Gramlich. Gramlich took it to Alan Greenspan, and Greenspan told Gramlich, drop it, which meant I'm not going to look at it, because he knew he was on the hook. So when the global collapse happened in 2008, 2009, and then the subsequent tragedies of all of the things that I've been talking about for the last few days, the divorces and the suicides and people losing their retirements and everything else based on this horrible engineered fraud that took out African Americans first to the tune of 60% of their net worth, and then ultimately the white working class that got set up in their pensions. And after they destroyed, the golden goose. And who destroyed the golden goose? If you go back to the 70s and 80s, right when we get into Reagan, you had all of these guys, these pillars of finance, that were doing these things called private equity. And that includes, by the way, Michael Milken, who ended up getting nailed for insider trading, but after they were going to bring a RICO statute against him when he was at Drexel Burnham Lambert. And then ultimately he goes away, he goes to Club Fed, everything else, the fines, they say he can't ever do anything. But now that guy, Michael Milken, is head of the Milken Institute. And, he is like the godfather of this whole thing. And, I remember seeing pictures during the Trump administration of him hanging out on private jets with Steve Mnuchin, because apparently, the government had hit the ceiling and Steve Mnuchin was flying on Milken's private plane. How's that for just fucking gross? Because at that time, the private equity guys were banking against and blowing up the golden goose. And the way they did that was they ultimately do that with short-term loans that they, are creating this scenario where it's a long, complicated story. It's not that long. I could, do another monologue on that. But ultimately, at the end, what they did was they knowingly set the companies up to fail, that they could pick pieces up on the cheap, because that's how they increased the share price of the stock. But ultimately, in the meantime, they got nothing but fees from banks that were actually loaning against this stuff. And so it's just the latest generation of what the English were doing for centuries, which is called smash and grab. And again, that's a whole nother story. So, when you fast forward through this process, we had 4 decades of deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. We had financialization through the Wall Street meritocracy that killed the golden goose to set up the situation, which is a myth. And so when it blew up, and all of these people were going down the drain, myself included, Addie Polk lost her life. Thousands of people lost their lives. They lost their incomes. They lost everything that they had worked on. Same with the white working class, of course. They lost 50% of their income from their pensions, and they were actually set up. I did a podcast recently with some insiders, a Securities and Exchange guy who knows this stuff inside and out, and he told me over and over they consider the pensions, meaning they, Wall Street, the hedge funds and all of the money managers that are involved with the stuff and the private equity guys, they say it out loud that they consider teachers and iron workers and pipe fitters and all of these other guys stupid money. Because none of those people are asking questions until it's too late. And then it's like, oh my God, I just lost everything I thought I was worth. Which brings us to now. So we might be on the crux. I don't know how we haven't had another absolute meltdown, but I think it's coming. It looks to me like there's no way it couldn't, given a lot of things that I pay attention to and everything else. But we're on a roll here. We're on a roll that there's hundreds of thousands of you, well, I should say 120,000 have been viewing and getting into the conversation and trying to figure out who I am and what I'm all about. And a lot of people are going to obviously criticize me because just what happens online. People, want to go after, I guess, the messenger. But in the long and the short of it, everybody is so quick to judge. They don't even know anything about anyone. But again, I'm coming out of the blue, so how would I expect you to know anything? I don't. Do your own due diligence. I beg you. Go to www.thecon.tv and study it. If you don't want to pay the $2 per episode, check it out, all the free information that we have on the website. I mean, we've got 30, 40 videos that are part of our YouTube channel that basically tell you all of the information that I'm telling you and more. And, I've been doing this for a long time. I know what I'm talking about. And, I'm here like Navy SEAL Team 6 going to truth bomb the con because, right now what's happening is we're getting ready for the midterms, right? So you've got all of these different scenarios and people are talking about, okay, well, Obama destroyed the working class and they destroyed, they don't even talk about the African Americans, but he talks about the white working class and why the white working class went over to MAGA and they're going to, basically support the Republican Party who supports Trump, who's been doing all of this stuff that I've been telling you with his business the entire time. So those are our choices. You've got, the blue side, which have been the ones who created this madness, and then the red side, the guys who play ball with this madness and just benefit from it. And so you don't have a choice that is life, liberty, and justice for all and the integrity of law, to where we have dynamism, to where we actually have supply and demand, to where we actually have an economy that works for people, that gives people who are really hardworking and very smart and innovative a chance to do fantastic things in the economy, which is the idea, and it has been at least most of my lifetime. But ultimately, I guess that's a myth now, just like everything else, right? And then, when you get to the end of that story, you see over and over, and this is the thing that I just desperately want you guys to understand above all else. Blackrock was in first position. I mean, I swear to God, every single day, whether it's Russell Brand, whether it's Joe Rogan, whether it's Crystal Ball or whomever else, they're kind of dancing around some of these things, but they just don't even know the basics. They don't know what the con is. They don't know that we put millions and 10 millions of illegal loans into these packages intentionally at every step of the line that then blew up the world, so that when it blew up, ultimately, and I've heard, guys that are supposedly in the know and great documentarians, I'll say Academy Award documentarians, that I put this information on their plate 5 years ago and they decided to ignore me and go with somebody else who will say things like, oh yeah, maybe they got $1 trillion in emergency relief and it's awful. And, they can go so far as to say Obama betrayed. They don't even say he betrayed the white working class. What they say is what Obama didn't do ultimately is what created this madness. Yeah, what Obama didn't do created this madness. He lied to us. And what's really annoying to me is some of his biggest supporters, like let's call it Oprah frickin' Winfrey, the woman who we saw during the Golden Globes a couple of years ago, stand up there in this triumph and this absolutely dignified, beautiful, a speech about, what was taking place during the civil rights movement, and another woman that we hadn't heard the name of that I think had been kind of a precursor to Rosa Parks. And, quite frankly, it was beautiful. But you know what? She ignored Addie Polk because Obama and the white in the Wall Street Democrats meritocracy, covered this up. And why would Obama, an African American president who obviously is supposed to, represent those types of people, especially because I think he owes it to them after 400 years of slavery and everything else that came from it, and Jim Crow and the Great Migration, everything that finally got to a point where somebody like Addie Polk could get a piece of the American dream, only to have it stolen from her, and then they put an African American president to basically cover for him. It's absolutely insanity, And then that leads us to Donald Trump and everything that took place since. And I'm telling you, man, Donald Trump, is horrific as all the stuff is with Obama and everything that Donald Trump, Jesus, it's not about those two bastards. they're playing the same game that has destroyed all of us, and it continues to. And I want to try to get to this at the end, and some of you have heard me say this before, but the Federal Reserve is the central bank. They're the lender of last resort. And there was a aspect of what we call 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act that enabled the Federal Reserve during and after the great financial crisis, which they referred to as the Bazooka, which is the secret code where, then Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, and Ben Bernanke, head of the Federal Reserve, who was this great expert on what took place during the Great Depression, what they did is they created liquidity and they bought back all the toxic assets. So that the banks, so ultimately what should have happened is if they were going to do that, we should have the FBI, the DOJ, and the SEC and all of the AGs around the country reveal to you exactly what I'm revealing to you now. But in the end, they didn't, because the states needed the money. Everybody needed the money. Everybody was out of money because it just evaporated because Wall Street blew up the world. And so the Federal Reserve that gets its credibility, or that's not what I want to say, not the credibility, but the true power of the Federal Reserve ultimately came from the sacrifice of the United States to defeat Hitler's Germany, to basically rise into the superpower that it became, so that ultimately the entire world started trading in US dollars, and everything that took place after Bretton Woods that gave us fiat currency that ultimately got tied to fossil fuel in the Middle East, which is a whole other aspect of it. But if you want to know the truth, the value of the dollar came from us being the good guy that purged, the hatred of the world and fascism to become this glorious, country that has every step of the way proved, whether it was, and forgive me those of you who are jaded and cynical, but I got to say this because you guys didn't actually fight on the battlefields of the revolution that fought King George III and the Redcoats, which was incredible odds, and they overcame, and they got us to, obviously, the Declaration of Independence, which created these ideas of separation of powers that gave us a country that supposedly was of, by, and for the people. Now, obviously, it's been touch and go the whole time, and the big debate between, Madison and Jefferson and getting to the central bank is a big part of this. And then ultimately, everything that led to the Federal Reserve and J.P. Morgan Chase having the influence that he did after he was the only one who had the gold, and after all the runs of 1890, after the Civil War and everything else. Guys, this has always been evolving. All right, just think about your own lives. What's happening at this very moment as you're listening to me and you're looking into my eyes and trying to figure out if I know what I'm talking about or not, to get you to that next step, you've got to know that wherever you are at this moment in your life came from everything that happened before. And what you do today, and an amalgamation of everything that happened before, is what's going to create the future for you, right? I've always framed this is that we have two columns of our soul. On one side of our soul, we have character, integrity, and dignity. On the other side of our soul, we have hypocrisy, duplicity, and complicity. It's what we are as people. And everybody else determines that outcome and how they play the game and where they are in the system based on whatever influence is happening to it at any given time. I hope that millions of you out there start coming forward with your stories about how you played a role in this, to what end. Because you guys, many of you have reached out to me over the years. You said, I was that broker and I feel ashamed of myself for doing it. Or I was an appraiser and I was stuck in a situation where I had my kid and my family that I had to, provide for. And if I didn't do exactly what the lenders told me to do, then I wouldn't get an income. And it's so on and so forth down the line, right? And so there was literally tens of millions of felonies that took place in this thing. And that's why we call it the largest engineered criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history, because Obama let him get away with it. That created the world we have. And now we're going to go into the midterms after the great insurrection and, everything that constitutes. And there's definitely a move towards fascism. And, who I am is just this guy that, again, I'm about liberty and justice for all above all else. I'm about the integrity of the system. None of us want to get on a plane that knows that the plane was sabotaged to fail, that so somebody can get, insurance money from us dying. I'm not expendable. Same with a car. If someone, sabotages the brakes. Come on, people. You literally can't be that freaking clueless. You got to have some common sense. And so I went on a decade-long adventure, odyssey, everything else, that picked up the pieces of this story, and I got it from the guys inside the system that were whistleblowers, witnesses, victims, everybody at every step of the way, including the guys from the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and everything else. And I finally got the answers that I needed because I knew none of this stuff made sense. And so why am I telling you this? And I think this is the icing on the cake that we all have to understand. I want to create a resurrection that basically gets the United States of, by, and for the people back to of, by the people, with separation of powers, and of course the integrity and the dignity of law. Because right now it's incredibly corrupt and everybody on the side knows it, except for the good people that we interviewed that are in the con. And by the way, I've got hundreds of hours of more information. This goes on so far, so beyond what I've already explained to you today, and I have throughout the last couple of days. Couple of weeks, that's generated 100,000 people. Man, God damn, tell everybody you know. Tell the world, man, the truth is here. It's right here. Patrick Lovell truth bombs the con. I'll just finish like I do with every time I think about this, because this is how it works in my head, man. You got to keep moving forward, onwards and upwards. And this is a film guy. I do want to make this reference because I've wanted to give up so many times. This thing has been soul crushing. It's destroyed my personal family life. I mean, I've laid everything on the line to try to get to this point, but I saw a movie on Netflix recently of this incredible Nepalese mountain climber and his team in a film called 14 Peaks. And his name is Nims. And Nims had this wonderful statement in this revelation that has been speaking to me ever since. He said, when you think you're fucked, you're only 45% fucked. Look, man, I'm fighting for truth, justice, in the American dream. That's where I land. Where do you land? Let's get this.